Hello everyone, welcome to the second week of Miss Dewick's Socials 9 class. These are going to be the notes for this portion of Socials, which is talking about Canada's Confederation. Now, we're just going to do a quick review of some definitions. Some of these you might already know. And you'll notice that one of the handouts for Socials 9 for this week is a definition sheet. You do not need to hand this in, you just need to write down the definitions. These are kind of for you, so if you hear me talking about them, you actually know what the definitions are. So I'm just going to go through these with the PowerPoint. So the first definition most of you will probably know, it's the Maritimes. So the term Maritimes means connected with the sea, and this means the provinces in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. Some people also include Newfoundland and Labrador, but it's kind of the three sort of smaller provinces at the bottom. Then we have suffrage. This means the right to vote, and oftentimes with the term suffrage, this is usually when we talk about women wanting to fight. So the suffragist movement, where women at the time were fighting for a right to vote. Next, we have infrastructure. So this is the community systems that make travel, communication, and business easier. Pretty much anything that we have in our town, such as roads, transportation, postal services, emergency services, all of this is considered infrastructure. And the way that countries pay for that is through taxes. So people pay for these and kind of benefit from using these within our system. Next, we have Confederation. This is a more or less permanent union of groups with political power vested in a central authority. Essentially, all that means is a group of either colonies or provinces or different areas coming together and deciding, you know what, we're going to instead have one kind of group in charge of everybody. We still have power amongst the smaller groups, but there's just everything, the last kind of who gets to say what is just kind of one singular sort of group or person. So obviously in Canada we have our Prime Minister, and he is in charge of basically making kind of final decisions on some of the bigger things happening in Canada. Next, we have Constitution. This is the laws that set the powers and responsibilities of the government and also guarantee the rights of the people. These are the rights that citizens have. So that essentially guarantees that you have, so if you see the little picture, Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, these are the rights that you have as citizens. So say, for instance, you have a right to move where you want in Canada, or choose what sort of job you have and things like that. Then we have treaties. So when we're talking about treaty for Canada, these are known as comprehensive land claim settlements, oftentimes between First Nations and colonists over land agreements. Now you can see a little picture. Later on, we're going to kind of look at the 11 sort of major treaties that happen throughout Canada. You'll notice that British Columbia doesn't have a lot of those because what ended up happening is kind of after the 11 treaties, that was kind of sort of it. There were a few treaties that were on Vancouver Island, and we'll get into those a little bit later. Next, we have assimilate. This means to join the majority group and give up the traditions of one's own group. Oftentimes, this could be things such as language or culture and things like that. Oftentimes, people will do this because either they are forced to do this, either the group's majority group says you have to be part of us or you can't do certain things. Other times, it could be in terms of jobs. The next one is annexation, the action of seizing something, especially land or territory, and it's usually done in a very forceful way. Next is the Métis, so a person of mixed First Nations and French Canadian ancestry, in particular people whose ancestry mostly originated around the Red River settlement and the Saskatchewan River. Now, this is a interesting group. We're going to learn a little bit more about them. One of the interesting things is for Métis, for quite some time, they weren't considered their own separate group until they kind of started seeing themselves as more distinct. They weren't entirely First Nations, and they weren't entirely colonist European. and kind of the interesting traditions that kind of came from this mixing of two cultures to create this new one. We're also going to be learning about something called the Red River Rebellion. This was a sequence of events that led to the 1869 establishment of the temporary government by the Métis, particularly their leader Louis Riel and some of his followers. And it essentially, what it created out of this rebellion was the province of Manitoba. We'll see in a little bit kind of what Canada's going to start looking like, and provinces that are being formed. And one of them came out of the Métis fighting for a place to call their own. The next one is treason. So the crime of betraying one's own country, especially by attempting to kill or overthrow the government. Pretty much in most countries, treason is usually punishable by death. All right, so we're now moving on to actually talking about Canada and confederations. So Canada deciding, instead of just being these colonies controlled by the Europeans, they're deciding to actually become a country, and kind of what that sort of looked like. So this is essentially a map of what's going to become Canada. You'll notice that it's also partially in French because I couldn't find a really nice map of North America at the time. So this was in 1791. If you kind of notice, we have Upper and Lower Canada. Remember, we just had the rebellions of Upper and Lower Canada. You've got kind of the colonies of the St. John's Island, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. You can see the United States. And then we've got all of Rupert's Land, which is currently being controlled by the British. You've got Newfoundland. And then over to the west, you have areas that are slowly being claimed by Great Britain, and then kind of everything in between. I also like that Louisiana in the south is currently kind of controlled by Spain, but as the United States kind of settles further west, all of those colonies of like Spain start moving farther south. So what were some things that essentially set things into motion for Confederation? One of them was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This is where Britain basically takes over all of the areas around the Great Lakes, which is where Ontario is. You also have the Quebec Act of 1774, and this basically said that the British created their common law or their criminal law system, which basically meant that if you were charged with something, the court system was like Britain's court system. It was also important to note that the areas around where Quebec is going to be, the French Canadians, we'll start calling them, still were able to keep their language and culture. Then what happened in 1791 is the Constitutional Act, which basically divided. So Quebec used to be called, well, Quebec, and then it got split up into Upper and Lower Canada. And then when Canada became a country, Upper and Lower Canada got the names Ontario and Quebec. So Quebec changed names from Quebec to something else back to Quebec. It's very confusing. You don't need to know that. You just need to know that basically Lower Canada will become Quebec. You also had the Union Act of 1840, which recommended that those Canadas, the Upper and Lower Canada, actually be united and both would be represented by the Senate and elected assembly. That meant that you picked who actually was going to represent you. So what were some reasons that people wanted Confederation? Well, one of them was the threat of annexation by the United States. So people were worried. Remember the War of 1812? For those of you who do, you know why people were kind of worried. For those of you who don't, the War of 1812 was basically the United States tried to take over Canada, and it didn't go over super well. So essentially, Canada's still a little bit worried that the United States might try that again because they're getting a little more powerful. So they thought if we are united, we're able to defend against the United States. There was also the fact of trade, because before this time, all of those tiny little colonies are pretty much being, they're just trading amongst themselves. But if they're all part of one nation, it doesn't cost as much to trade within your own country. There was also the interest in having a national railway and actually having infrastructure that would be paid for by the new country that would essentially come out of all of this. Britain very much wanted Canada to become its own nation. And one of the reasons that Britain wanted Canada to be its own nation is because it was tired of paying for all of Canada's debts. Probably some of you have heard me use the analogy that America was like the brooding teenager that was angry with Britain and so left the house at a young age, kicking and screaming, and wanted to be independent. Canada was like the 40-year-old still living in Britain's basement, and Britain didn't really want to pay for stuff anymore. So there's this push from a lot of people, a lot of representatives of Britain to really push for Canada to be its own country. You can see in this little political cartoon, you've got little tiny wee baby Canada standing in the middle. I don't know why you gave that baby a gun, but you've got to the left, you've got Uncle Sam, who's a representative of the United States, and then you have on the other side, on the right, Lady Britannia, or Mother Britannia, and they're both kind of just letting Canada become its own thing, but still getting relatively closely. Canada still has very large ties to Britain, and that can even be seen in World War I and World War II. When Britain went to war, Canada followed suit. So some of the steps towards Confederation were there was the Charlottetown Conference, and these were all the maritime provinces, and they had a meeting to decide, are we actually going to join Confederation? You have the Quebec Conference, which was deciding, okay, if we're going to be a country, what is that going to look like? Then you had the London Conference. This is where the British North American Act was signed, and this is spelling out, okay, what are some of the rules of this country? How is it going to be governed? What is that going to look like? Then in 1867, those colonies in North America united under the British North American Act and became the Dominion of Canada. Which is really interesting because the Dominion of Canada, that was the name that Canada was. It wasn't just Canada. And I tried to find online when that name changed. And I couldn't really find anything. Pretty much people just stopped calling it the Dominion of Canada, just shorthanded it to Canada, and that's what it is right now. You will also notice right in the middle, there's a gentleman. I'm just going to circle him. This right here is the Prime Minister. This is John A. Macdonald, and he becomes the first Prime Minister of Canada. So as you can see on this map, Sir John A. Macdonald becomes the Prime Minister. Now he's an interesting fellow. He's got a very interesting sort of colorful history, as many politicians in Canada did. He makes Ottawa the capital city. They moved it. First they wanted it to be Toronto, but then they realized that was a little too close to the United States, so they moved it further northwards. And there was actually only 4 provinces that joined: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Pretty much everybody else hadn't joined or was not invited to the table to talk about it. And it's very interesting because if you look at this map, this is essentially what Canada looked like. You'll also notice that the pictures of Quebec and Ontario, that was the size of the provinces when they first joined. Obviously, that was not the size that they are today because all of that was Rupert's Land. So as Rupert's Land is slowly essentially bought by Canada, those provinces start to change shape. Pretty much nothing else in North America was considered Canada at that time. So all this is right here is just kind of showing which provinces and the dates in which they joined Confederation. Now, you don't need to memorize these dates. All you need to know is that the Confederation of Canada was a long, long process, all the way from 1867 to 1999. And you can even see just some interesting things. We can see British Columbia, 1871. It's interesting because if you look down at Newfoundland and Labrador, they did not join Canada until 1949. That was after World War II, which is kind of funny that we had just this little British colony off our coast and they're like, hey, maybe we'll be part of Canada. And the last one, which is kind of interesting, is 1999. I was alive to see this. I remember maps when I was in elementary school that didn't have Nunavut on them. Basically, the Northwest Territories kind of split in two, and Nunavut essentially became its own territory. So that's kind of interesting. Then you have the British North American Act. Now, essentially what that was it was an act written by actually mostly Canadians in Canada. And it had a couple things in it. One of them was called an amending formula. So this is the method of changes which could be made to the British North American Act, which is great because as years go on, things change in the law, and you want to be able to change essentially your constitutions. It also recognized the authority of the British monarch. So as much as Britain doesn't really want to be part of Canada or controlling it, they still had representatives that kind of sort of like babysat Canada. They still wanted to be able to kind of use Canada if they needed it, but they didn't want to have to pay for it anymore. So then in 1869, so kind of after everything, Canada has become a country, Canada eventually purchases Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company and starts trying to settle further west. Now this will start leading into kind of one of our first conflicts we're going to talk about in the class, which is the Red River Rebellion. The problem was, though, is Canada, essentially as it's settling west, wants to take more and more land. But there's people on that land, and one group of people that were there were the Métis, and we'll talk a little bit about them kind of in the upcoming weeks. Okay, so for this assignment, this is your summary of perspectives assignment that you will be completing this week, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it because when you first get it, it might be a little confusing. So what the summary of perspectives is your task is to read through, because there were a lot of different groups that had some ideas of whether they were for or against Confederation and some interesting information. So your task is to find a little bit about each of those sections from the handout and write down some of that information on the chart. Point form is totally fine, and you probably want to have at least a minimum of 2 points of information per box. You'll also notice that there's an X through some of the boxes. You don't need to write anything in those because there isn't enough information to actually write anything. So you've got Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, PEI, the Indigenous people, and Great Britain. So you just need to essentially point form, find some information. And I'm actually going to help you with the first one. So I'm actually going to do the first one with you as kind of a guided so that you know exactly what you need to be writing. So if you look at the assignment, it's actually, I've copied all the information onto the PowerPoint for you to see, is looking at the province of Canada, Upper Canada. This also, some people refer to it as Canada West. This is essentially going to be Ontario. So it says John A. Macdonald and his allies mobilized massive support for Confederation. George Brown and his supporters, that's the opposition, also saw more advantages than drawbacks, although they had some reservations. So some of the main areas in Upper Canada, obviously Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa. So this is essentially Upper Canada becomes Ontario. So one of the reasons that they were for Confederation was representation. The province would finally get more representatives to match its growing population. It would therefore carry more political weight within new Confederation than in the province of Canada. So what they were hoping to get from this is the fact, because there's more people currently living in Upper Canada, that meant they'd get more representatives because there's just more people there. There was also the fact of prosperity. So Confederation would create new markets, meaning more money. It would make railway companies more profitable and help people enter the territory to settle land in the West. So all of this meant more money. So Upper Canada was really into that. There was also the security. Confederation would allow better military protection against the Americas and others. So because, remember, they were a little bit worried about America kind of marching in again and trying to take over, they thought if we're unified, it means we're stronger. And as a result, since the advantages were so obvious, 54 of the 62 members of the Legislative Assembly from Canada West voted in favor of ratifying the Confederation Initiative. So tons of people, it was overwhelmingly majority of people were like, in the Legislative Assembly were like, yes, we do want Canada to become a country. So let's carry that information into our chart. Now you'll notice that I took some of the major points. You'll notice that it was really nicely laid out. It had kind of 3 things it talked about, so I pulled 3 points from those. The first one obviously being that the province gets more representatives in the government. The second is would allow better military protection, and the third, it would create new markets, so more money. You'll notice that I wrote these very shorthand, very point form. That's all you need to write. Please also make sure, though, that you're not just writing like, say, representation. Give a little bit more than that. Under additional facts, some things that you could look up that many of the sections have is you could look up, okay, who was the main leader of that area? So we had John A. Macdonald. What were some of the main areas? Toronto, which, because we know that Upper Canada will eventually be changed to Ontario. And then an additional fact that I got out of the middle is the fact that 54 of 62 members actually voted in favor. So that's the assignment, and hopefully it'll be easy for you guys to understand. If you have any questions, I'm actually going to have kind of office hours. I'm going to set up a Zoom assignment or a Zoom check-in on Thursday of next week, which is the 16th, when our class is happening, which is 10 a.m. So if you have any questions, you can check in and I can help you with the assignment.